Hello, how are you this evening? Thank you so much for those that are tuning in live, or even if you're reviewing this after the taping. I so appreciate you, prayer family, our family of circle that we're developing as we go through these 21 days in our Rehoboth prayer. It is such a blessing and an honor to be before you. I do not take it lightly. I hope you had a great day here in Chicago. The heat index was up around 107. Very, very hot. So if you live in the Chicagoland area, I do pray that you stay cool and hydrated, and then sought after people who possibly did not have, you know, cooling systems, and were able to check on your elderly and things of that nature. But anyway, good evening. So I did not do any posts yesterday, so we're actually at day number 4. So that may mean I may have to extend past the August 9th, the end date. But I just pray that you be flexible with me as we go through this time. We are still in Genesis, the 26th chapter, and it's a lot of meat on the bone, as they say. As it regards to Isaac's life and what he's doing here in this temporary place called Gerar. So I just want to recap a little bit. So the first few verses in Genesis, part 1, we begin to talk about the promises that God made Isaac. And what a joy is it for those that have children, especially when we obey and follow God's commands, how God would even transfer our obedience to our children, and they would even inherit blessings from God because of our obedience. So we just, I think I've said this in another video, we just don't want to leave an inheritance of money and wealth, but we also want to leave a spiritual inheritance that will take them even further than money and wealth. So Abraham left an inheritance for Isaac that went beyond the land and the great name that even the Lord said he would have, but he left him a legacy of obedience. And we know through Abraham's life he had some challenges, but we see that even God still said that he was faithful and that he obeyed. In verse 5 says, Abraham obeyed God's voice, kept his charge, kept his commandments, kept God's statutes, and kept God's laws. So God was pleased with Abraham's life. So that is the legacy that he left for his son Isaac. And because of his obedience, Isaac in turn received the blessings of the Lord. So we discussed that. We also discussed, since we started this Rehoboth prayer last week, we also discussed how in the midst of being reminded of God's promises, that we must also look at our cloud of witnesses. Now, Abraham was a witness of God's goodness, and Isaac saw Abraham live that out in his life through his father. But what about your cloud of witnesses? Have you written them down? Have you sought after? Have you remembered who are the people that you saw God do great things through, even when you thought the situation was hopeless? So we got to be reminded of our cloud of witnesses. The next thing we want to be reminded of, we talked a little bit about during the course of the time, is about why Isaac was in Gerar in the first place, and that because we find out that there was a famine in the land. And so sometimes God puts us in places that are temporary to avoid other situations. Now, that wasn't his call at that point. God didn't want him to experience the famine. So sometimes when God calls us to stay put, stay in place, is to avoid unnecessary unnecessary trials and tribulations that we're not called to. So sometimes we move out of place too fast, and it causes us to have to experience things that were really not for us, but because we moved out of place, we have to experience it. But we see here, even in Genesis 26 verse 6, we see that Isaac dwelt in Gerar. So we know that he stayed. Then we talked about the last posting, which me, myself personally, in all honesty, I felt was probably a little gibberish that day, so to speak. I felt like I probably went too over the top talking about authority. But this is what I really want you to know. Whatever place that God has you in, remember there's always going to be some level of authority you have to deal with. Even if that authority is God, you still have to deal with some level of authority. So we have Isaac here who had told the fib about his wife Rebecca being his sister because he was afraid that they would kill him and take his wife, which is another part of what we discussed too about being fearful of staying places because of what we might lose. But after he dealt with Abimelech and he talked to him and was upfront with him and told him the truth and said, hey, I thought you were going to take my wife. I thought the people were going to take my wife, so I told the story. Then Abimelech, being a man in authority, he was the king, he put out a decree and said, if anybody touches this man's wife, they're going to basically have to deal with me. And I believe the scripture actually goes on to say, if you look in your own Bible, whatever you're reading, it goes on to say that actually if anyone touches his wife, they will be put to death. So when he dealt with the authority, even though he had told a story, he wasn't quite upfront in the beginning. When he was confronted, he told the truth and it worked out in his behalf. So really, for the sake of this, I want you to understand that authority can and does work, but you just have to be obedient to it in its place. Is there a time to disobey authority? I probably won't comment on that too much, but I believe there is a time when it's in direct violation of what you believe, your core beliefs. And I'm not going to get into argument. See, I'm going too far talking about authority. Just for the sake of our passage, we're going to talk about how Abimelech, as the authority, Isaac responded to it, and it worked out in his behalf because he dealt with the authority, because he was graced for that place he was in. Now, for today, day 4. So that was just a recap. So for day 4, we're actually all the way now down to Genesis chapter 26 again. And we're all the way down to 12, verse 12. Now, here is the interesting thing about what is said. After all that has happened, after God has said what he said, Isaac has did what he did, has done what he's done, and then Abimelech has said what he said and done what he's done, it says something key in verse 12. It says, Isaac sowed in that land and reaped the same year a hundredfold, and the Lord blessed him. And I'm reading from the New King James Version. That is so awesome, because even though the place you're in might be a temporary place, you are still required to be a benefit to the place. You are not allowed to just sit back with your legs crossed and not do anything. You are called and charged in that place to sow into it and also to reap from it. So this is just not a place where you're just sitting put and being idle. This is a place that you should find yourself in right now, where even though you may not want to be there, it's the place that God has called you. You have to stay put there, but you are required to sow into that land. So what does that mean for us? For Isaac, that meant growing animals, and sowing the field. But for us in our present day, that may mean developing systems and strategies to help a department, to help a company. That may also mean keeping the house clean or the apartment straight that you are currently living in, and not tearing the place up because you happen to be with a slum landlord, but it's just what you have to do right now. There are some things you have to do. You have to sow into that land. And what happens when you sow into that land? The scriptures goes on to say, and Isaac reaped in the same year a hundredfold, and the Lord blessed him. Whatever you are called in right now, at this very present moment, and you begin to sow into it, I believe God thinks of us no less than he thought of Isaac. That when you sow into the land that you're in right now, you will reap in that land. And not only will you reap, you will receive more than you given, a hundredfold, because the Lord is going to bless you. And sometimes it is hard to stay faithful in a place where we feel we just don't want to be there. Whatever that circumstance is, whether it's a marriage, whether it's even as a whole group of things. I won't go into naming things, but it can be a conglomerate of things of where you feel like you don't want to be, but the God has called you. In a minute, you begin to go into that place and sow. And you know what's interesting about sowing is that it also begins to put your heart in a place. It puts your heart in a place. It's very difficult to sow your time, your energy, even your finance into a place